Alright you guys, as you can see by the thumbnail, I'm back with another one like the other one. Well, not a story, that'll be coming next, but this is your next Q&A. And as always, there was a lot of good questions, but unfortunately, as you guys know, I can only get so many in at one time. So if I didn't get you in on this one, look for your question to come out in the next one. So without further ado, let's get straight to it. So Maddie829 says, I've heard of a lot of people use the term real one. What's your definition of a real one, and what does this mean to you? I see you guys definitely brought your A game today because these were some good questions, some of the best that I've seen in a long time. And I say that because these were questions that I couldn't just answer at will. I had to brainstorm and think about some of these things, but I wouldn't want it any other way. So this whole thing about being a real one is something I thought a lot about, and there's definitely a lot of variables when it comes to this, and I'll try to explain why. So when you hear someone use the term real one to describe somebody else, it's usually in the sense of someone who's considered to be a stand-up guy, and you'll usually hear someone refer to someone as a real one when they've either done something that's considered to be admirable or right after they do something that's considered to be commendable or praiseworthy. But I guess this question is perspective specific. It just depends on what we believe in and how we see things as individuals. Because what might be a real one to you might not be a real one to someone else, and vice versa. It just depends on who you ask and what they believe in. I'll give you guys an example. So at times, I've heard people refer to someone as a real one because maybe they caught a serious case where they were facing decades in prison and they were just in a bad situation. And despite being faced with that type of adversity, instead of cooperating with law enforcement and doing whatever they could to help themselves, instead, they ended up holding their mug and they took a long prison sentence on the chin. Some people would refer to someone like that as a real one, just based on the fact that they stood true to the game and for not folding under pressure. But again, it's all a matter of opinion. Because others might look at this same set of circumstances and say that this dude is a big dummy for throwing his whole life away. For what? For a false sense of pride or for staying true to a belief system that only a small minority of people believe in? On the flip side, someone who still finds some glorification in prison and the prison lifestyle might call someone who spent 30 years in the shoe and who didn't debrief or fold under that type of adversity a real one for being a stand-up guy and for just staying true to his beliefs. And maybe he is, but it's easy to say that when you're standing on the outside looking in. People seem to give a lot of praise and admiration to other people who make these kinds of choices for themselves, but it's lightweight comical how fast their perspectives change when they find themselves in a situation like this, and it's their lives that are hanging in the balance. And then here's something else to think about. You hear people refer to members of some of these criminal organizations as real ones all the time. The Mexican Mafia, the Nuestra Familia, the Aryan Brotherhood, or the Black Guerrilla Family. And this is just based on their status as members. Or you'll hear them being referred to as legends, something that not only sounds ridiculous, but something that also sounds as corny as the individual who's saying it. And most of the time, it's coming from people who are no longer active and who are considered to be no good themselves. I don't know if they assume that this incessant form of brown nosing is going to somehow give them some type of pass or score them some brownie points, but when I hear it, I always get a good laugh out of it. But here's the thing, how do you make that distinction and separate it when it becomes contradictory or when it takes on a level of hypocrisy? Because either you're a real one or you're not. Because how can you call someone a real one for as long as they continue to push that line, but then the minute that they either drop out or do something that gets them in bad standings, now they're no longer considered to be a real one. Now they're either a piece of trash, a degenerate, a dropout, or some other derogatory term that people might use to label them. So I guess based on what I've seen, that you're a real one until you're not. But to sum this all up and to give you the simple short answer, let me just put it like this. Setting aside all this prison hoopla and this other belief system that people try to promote for the purpose of making themselves look like they're real ones themselves, or that they're keeping it gangster for staying true to the game. That is until they find themselves in that situation, and then it's no longer about playing this little make-believe game that they play. I'm just going to close this up by saying this. I think someone who's ambitious about taking care of his family and who spends 30 years of his life out here working, being a father, and taking care of his business to be a real one as well. It's not always about being a violent stand-up gang member who's down for a shit and who's willing to accept whatever type of adversity he's faced with. Sometimes it's just about doing the right thing and about being morally correct. Not based on the belief system of an active gang member, but based on the belief system that society itself lives by. So TW882W58 wants to know, is it possible for an active NF member to stay out on the streets for a long period of time while being involved in criminal activity and while functioning in an NF street regiment? For the most part, I'm going to say no, and I'll explain why. I'm going to answer this question being as honest as I possibly can, and regardless of whether people agree with me or not. A lot of this is based on personal experience. Nobody makes it for a long period of time out there on the streets anymore. It just doesn't happen. And the main reason for that is because of people either telling, people being envious of what you're doing out there and what you have, or law enforcement going that extra mile to get you. But let me clarify what I'm trying to say. Someone who's out there pushing a lot of weight has more of a chance making it for an extended period of time if they're not messy and if they just stick to a basic game plan by avoiding making a lot of the mistakes that a lot of people make out there. Things like not having a lot of traffic at your house, not getting greedy, not dealing with people you don't really know, etc., etc. Those are usually the kind of mistakes that end up getting a lot of people busted. Trying to force the issue and breaking your own policies. But again, if you're just someone out there who's trying to make a living and you're dropping a lot of weight, you might be able to make it for a while because someone like that isn't a priority for law enforcement. You become to be a priority for them when they find out you're tied in with a criminal organization like the Mexican Mafia, the Nuestra Familia, the Aryan Brotherhood, or the Black Guerrilla family. They don't like organized crime on any level. You know, the cops that took me down even told me this. They said, we don't give two shits about people who are out here trying to make a living or who are just trying to take care of their families. But as soon as you link up with the fellas and we find out you're working with a criminal organization, that's when we have a problem with it. The other thing you need to think about is this. You don't want to sling long term either. Not with the way politics are being pushed nowadays anyway. Because let's just say you run a low-key operation and you manage to do your thing for a good minute without getting caught up. If you're out there slinging some weight and you've been doing it for a good minute, longer than what people are used to, then eventually they're going to start looking at you sideways, wondering how you're still out there and why you haven't drawn the ire of law enforcement. People are going to start to assume that you're working with law enforcement and they're going to begin questioning your integrity. That's how bad the political game is out there. And then if it really goes bad, they're going to run with that assumption and look for other reasons that would justify taking you out. It happens all the time. And the last thing I'll say is this. You got to remember that if you're functioning within an NF street regiment or a Mexican Mafia street crew, then you're going to be involved with a lot more than just the sales and distribution of narcotics. You're going to be involved in the criminal element across the board. So again, don't expect to be involved in that lifestyle and think you're just going to be on a 5 or 10 year rip making all this money living the good life. Just expect it to be very short-lived and that you're basically going to be out there on borrowed time as soon as you get out there. So Gordo66 wants to know, what's an NF member's recourse for counterattacking dirty politics? I've heard you and several other content creators in the prison genre allude to the presence of dirty politicking and backbiting within that lifestyle, almost as if this is a common stratagem that some members use for eliminating someone. So what steps can you take to avoid dirty politicking and underhanded political maneuvering when it's being directed at you? Recourse? Really? Your question kind of has the hidden answers in the details. So once upon a time, there used to be this great thing called due process that NF members, Norteños, and its associates with the kind of recourse that you're talking about. However, some of the historical NF stalwarts from the past, such as MC, Brown Bob, and Tibbs, just to name a few, found out that this beautiful thing called due process was nothing more than an illusion or a bogus political countermeasure that was only drafted for the purpose of making it look like there was some actual recourse or relief to fall back on. But again, dirty politics spoiled the game, and although due process looked good and sounded good, the real truth behind it is that it only really applied to a select few and only when the political scheme benefited the circumstances. You know, I'm not going to get too deep into it, but there's also a GAO, which is in essence one of the acting 3 high offices or one of the NF generals that is supposed to act as the organization's internal affairs. And it's his job to investigate major internal conflicts, major disputes between members, to investigate false accusations that are being made about fellow members, or to basically resolve issues of maltreatment where someone's suffering some type of punishment or effectuation that was wrongfully administered. But based on everything that I've seen in the past, the GAO position has always failed to implement any form of corrective action and has basically been rendered useless. And with respects to MC, Brown Bob, and Tibbs, the GAO acted as nothing more than a rubber stamp and did nothing to help either one of these brothers. The individual who was appointed to act as the GAO at the time, who I'm not going to name, could have thrown MC a lifeline and could have pulled him out of the water. But instead, he stood by and let him drown, despite being in possession of mitigating evidence that clearly proved that MC was being framed. And I know this because I was personally involved in that investigation and I was the one that provided that evidence. But anyways, I'm getting off track. The last part of this that I want to make sure I bring some clarity to is this. Unfortunately, one of the ugly realities that continues to exist within that lifestyle is dirty politicking, backstabbing, and political maneuvering. And no matter what safeguards or what countermeasures are put in place to stop it, it's always going to happen and it's always going to exist. Look at the Mexican Mafia, for example. It has strict policies in place that forbids its members from politicking against each other because they obviously understand how detrimental this can be. But yet, it still exists and it's often still done openly. I guess in some ways, it's almost kind of comparable to a self-weeding process, where the stronger links dispose of the weaker links. And that's why self-survival in this lifestyle is often dependent on how savvy you are when it comes to how you push your politics. So Bobby Faye 33 wants to know, the Nuestra Familia, the Mexican Mafia, and the Aryan Brotherhood have all undergone some serious criminal indictments by law enforcement from the early 90s to date. And the political fallout has been devastating. It's resulted in everything from a lot of members walking away, others getting shipped off to state and federal prison, the loss of trust amongst each other, and a huge loss of morale. How do you bounce back from this type of adversity, and how do you continue to stay motivated amongst so much negativity? I don't know how to say it any other way other than you just have to. You got to understand that these things are going to happen and that it's all part of the lifestyle when you sign up and make that commitment. Criminal indictments, criminal cases, long prison sentences, and life in prison all come with the territory. And if you have both an honest sponsor and the one who's raising his hand to bring you in, then they'll tell you this. They're not going to candy coat these things or lead you to believe anything different. The same way that MC told me when he was bringing me into the fold. He told me straight up that there was no pot of gold at the other end of the rainbow. He said, this lifestyle ain't for everyone, and it's a hard lifestyle because at the end of the day, your future is already predestined to either life in prison, death, or you're gonna walk away in bad standings. He told me that those were the three options that I was headed for, and that one of them was already written out for my future. Imagine that. The one thing that's kind of discouraging as I look back in retrospect when all this was playing out is that none of us seem to have learned anything or capitalized off the mistakes that we continue to keep making. At some point, when history keeps repeating itself and we continue to keep making the same mistakes, you would think that we would learn from it. But instead, we all continue to keep stepping in the same pile of shit. I'm talking about phone taps, the recorded county jail or prison phones that we all knew were being recorded, and things like that. But yet we continue to keep conducting business over them that eventually led to more criminal cases, or the way that others were exposed or made privy to certain aspects of business. All this will come back to hurt us even more, which either led to people cooperating and telling on us, or was exposed to other people who had no business knowing. Like I said, at some point when history continues to keep repeating itself, you have to somehow find the ability to capitalize on it and grow from it so that the same mistakes aren't repeated. But it just continued to happen. Either somebody thought they were smarter and had a better system, or someone was just so careless that tunnel vision blinded them and they got reckless. It's crazy when you think about it, but the BGF seems to be the only criminal organization who hasn't continued to suffer these kinds of criminal indictments. The NF, MA, and AB have all been lambasted one after another since the 90s, and law enforcement haven't shown any signs of letting up off the pressure either. But let me be clear about the reasons why the BGF hasn't been hit with these kinds of criminal indictments. It has nothing to do with them being smarter or anything like that. The only reason they haven't been targeted is because they kind of lost a lot of their sway over the years, and they're just not functioning on that kind of organized level. They still exist, but they're so far under the radar and their activities are so small that law enforcement doesn't even bother with going after them. And as you said, the political fallout has been devastating for not only the NF but also for the MA and the AB as well. All three of these organizations have lost a lot of their manpower. A lot of the key players ended up cooperating, and then others were stretched out and shipped off to federal prison. There's been so many NF members alone that have been shipped off to federal prisons that it's even changed the whole political landscape of how politics are being pushed in the federal system. What I mean by that is this. Over the last 10 to 15 years, there's been so many NF members that have been shipped off to the federal system that the NF is now forced to be reckoned with in the federal system. They have numbers now, and they even have their own yards. And it wasn't like that before. NF members were a small minority in comparison to a handful of Norteños who were spread out to different USPs. And again, like I said, this has had an impact on the politics. And then considering how Corny, Pinky, and Skip are all recruiting machines, they've been effective at recruiting allies, NF members and Norteño sympathizers from other states. So Sharkstero22 wants to know, considering the revelation of AI, social media, and just false propaganda in general, How do you defend yourself against bogus or counterfeit accusations that might be made against you? And what steps would you take? Now, this is a good question, and it's actually something that I haven't really seen someone encounter as of yet. You gotta remember, AI is still fairly new, and this revelation is just now coming into the fold. But the technology and the things that can be done with AI are scary. I mean, you've got people who are so savvy when it comes to what they can do with AI, creating fake audio that sounds like the real person. Some of you might even remember when Ghostface tried doing that to Bozo. He came out with fake audio clips. That was all AI generated. Manufacturing fake paperwork, manufacturing fake imagery, etc., etc. The scope of what they can do is endless. I guess defending yourself against something like this basically just depends on what it is and the circumstances. The only thing that you can do to prove that it's fake is to pull the case numbers and run it that way. At some point, you're gonna hit a wall where you can show it's fake because it won't be filed and it won't bear any certified stamps. But the messed up thing about it is that even though you can eventually prove that it was manufactured, until you do, it can still create a cloud of suspicion and lead some people to second guess the individual who's being targeted. Until you do, it can still create a cloud of suspicion and lead some people to second guess the individual that's being targeted. Some of it's also just going to come down to you and your character. What people might or might not believe to be true based on what either does or doesn't line up with your character. And like I said, some of these guys are so savvy and skilled when it comes to this AI stuff that even if it is eventually proven to be AI generated, it's still going to create some doubt or cause people to question the validity of it while it's being looked into. And obviously that can still be damaging. I don't think I need to go over all the different scenarios and possibilities that it could lead to, as you guys are smart enough to figure out some of that stuff for yourselves. But again, it's scary just thinking about the potential of what could be done and how it could actually be successful at sabotaging someone's character, despite it being temporary or not. So Cam44 wants to know, the NF forbids its members and associates from working together hand in hand with COs or law enforcement on any level. In fact, some households or establishments even require a second set of ears to be present whenever there's any interaction or dealings with them, just to ensure that everything remains above board. With this being the case, where do you draw the line and how are they compromised with these safeguards in place? No, this is true. Trust is something that's practically non-existent in prison amongst all the different factions. But I can say that this is especially true when it comes to the NF, the Norteños, and its associates. There is no more trust. And this was all intensified by a lot of the past criminal indictments that the NF has suffered over the past 20 years. With the indictments, obviously there was a lot of NF members, Norteños, and its associates that ended up cooperating and walking away. And it was this betrayal that created a lot of the mistrust and loyalty issues within this organization. No, anyone that's been around Norteños in prison knows that they run one of the most structured, strictest, and well-maintained programs out of all the different group segments that there is. They're very disciplined and everything's meticulously controlled. They're almost too structured. So I want to say it was after Operation Black Widow and Operation Valley Star that everything shifted and the entire movement changed. Some of the fundamental concepts that used to be some of the NF strengths and power, things like carnalismo, unity, organization, structure, resilience, and fortitude, were replaced with things like distrust, skepticism, doubt, confusion, insecurity, and division. You know, at one point, I remember hearing about NF policies that were being implemented by Conejo from Sacra, one of the former NF generals who was illegitimately placed in a leadership position before him and his minions were eventually indicted in Operation Quiet Storm. Because there was a serious lack of trust at that time, Conejo actually had some of his security perform strip searches on other Norteños who were responsible for smuggling in narcotics from the visiting room. You know, that's some of the craziest shit that I've ever heard. But because he was concerned about them possibly tampering with the D that was coming in, he was making them comply with mandatory strip searches. Other Norteños were actually having their personal mail screened and read because of a heightened sense of concern about the possibility of NF members from the federal faction communicating with NF members or Norteños in the state system. You know, and this type of personal intrusion and a clear violation of their personal privacy created disdain and a level of resentment towards leadership. You know, I was in custody at the Santa Clara County Jail fighting my case at the time, but I heard that the morale was as bad as it's ever been and that the Norteño spirit was almost completely broken. I mean, you can only push and pull your people so far before they reach a breaking point or before they end up getting so discouraged that they start to turn their backs and walk away. And that's what they were doing. And that's with anyone, not just the NF and the Norteños. But let me respond to the rest of your question with respects to how it's possible to compromise COs and get them in pocket when there's strict policies that are sometimes in place that forbid NF members or Norteños from working hand in hand with them. I'll be completely honest with you guys. These types of policies only apply to Norteños or others who are at the very bottom of the totem pole. I'll use myself as an example, and I say this without any ego or self-embellishment. None of that stuff matters to me anymore, so don't misinterpret this. But because I was an NF member, and even more importantly, a leader, these kinds of policies didn't apply to me or others like me. I wouldn't have to go get another Norteño or another NF member to stand next to me and monitor any conversations that I might have had with COs. It had nothing to do with me thinking that I was above some of the policies that I had actually drafted myself. It was more so because I was a leader, a trusted leader, and I didn't need anyone to listen in on my conversations. The lower level Norteños who knew this policy applied to them complied with it. But some of the COs that were compromised and who we eventually got to be part of the team were compromised or manipulated through individuals like myself who were either trusted or who were in leadership positions themselves. Because let's be real, in order for you to get a CO to a point to where he or she is willing to put their job or their career on the line and entertain the possibility of smuggling in drugs or other forms of contraband, first requires an immense amount of trust. They have to feel like they can trust you first, and this isn't something that's going to happen overnight. It's a time-consuming process, and it happens during the course of daily interaction. There's nothing special or inherently different about cops or correctional officers with the exception of their training. The training that they all go through that tells them that all inmates are mass manipulators and that this is something that they need to be mindful of. That's what you have to get past. Otherwise, they forge relationships and trust just like anyone else. So again, it just takes time and it's a work in progress. There's no other way around it. Because think about it. If none of us had the ability to work on some of these COs individually alone, the ones that demonstrate the characteristics that indicate that they're moldable and that they could potentially be compromised, then it would never happen. Those doors would never get open because you can't work on them with another set of ears right there hounding them, listening to everything that's going on. They wouldn't be receptive to that. Policy or not, they probably feel like they were being played or set up. So those policies applied to who they applied to. And certain members of leadership or those that had proven that they were trustworthy and who also had the ability to manipulate and flip these guys were the ones who were allowed to work on these guys and other free staff that were targeted. And here's the other thing. Make no mistake about what the definition of working with COs or other members of the administration means. This specifically means working with them or dealing with them in a way that would be considered to be inappropriate, such as exposing information that would be considered to be telling, having other inmates rolled up or moved off the yard, or just dealing with them in some kind of way that is clearly in violation. So Nifty 3030 wants to know, the NF and some of these other criminal organizations such as the ME, the AB, and BGF are always evolving with the times, adapting and readapting, not only for the purpose of staying current, but also to stay ahead of the changes in criminal law, the streets, and just the culture in general. But what do you think about some of the habits and mannerisms that some NF members are exhibiting today? Using the N-word, wearing iced out grills, and just conducting themselves with a different kind of swag that's definitely different from the past. Yeah, this is a good question, and I think I've got a pretty good perspective on this one, especially since I was born and raised in the Bay Area. I don't think I need to give you guys a history lesson and tell you that most of this new generation that use the N-word do it based on slang and cultural changes that have taken place over the years. It has absolutely nothing to do with race or racism, as you even got little white kids in the suburbs of some of the Midwest states like Nebraska, Kentucky, and West Virginia using the N-word. But personally, I just can't get on board with it. And when I hear people talk like that, I get discouraged. I'm not one of those types of individuals who gets all bent out of shape or caught up in the whole people losing touch with their own ethnicity or their own identity because now all of a sudden I'm someone who places a lot of emphasis on people's ancestry. But I do think people should try to be somewhat genuine and that they shouldn't try to mimic something that they're not. As far as the NF continuing to evolve and constantly changing to keep pace with the times, I've seen a lot of these changes take place over the years, and I think the NF survival is dependent on this, especially as it pertains to law enforcement, criminal law, and how it operates both on the streets and behind the walls. Because if you don't have the ability to change and you remain stagnant, you'll never advance and you'll be too predictable. But one of the more dramatic changes that I've seen over the years with respects to the NF pertains to some of the actual NF members themselves. You know, in some of my past stories or profiles that I've ran on some of the members, I've alluded to the caliber and quality of NF members that are being recruited these days as bottom feeders and mudsuckers. And despite the fact that these terms might sound disrespectful and, for lack of a better term, these aren't my intentions. I'm just being brutally honest about what I see now in comparison to what I was used to seeing years ago when I was recruited myself. You know, back in the 80s and 90s, it just seemed like the recruiting standards were a lot stricter than they are today, and that NF members not only walked and talked a certain way, but they also looked a certain way as well. And I'm not just talking about being all slung back with ink and being in top-notch physical shape, but there was also a certain level of respect that we used to carry ourselves with as well. You know, I remember when some of us were being indoctrinated in Pelican Bay, and part of the curriculum included reading dictionaries and thesauruses. The intended purpose was to improve our vocabulary so that we communicated like professionals. We were even encouraged to stop using profanity, as it just wasn't a good look. But from everything that I've been seeing, these standards are no longer being pushed. And the rap industry also seems to be having some influence on this as well. Because now you're seeing actual NF members who are not only rapping, but who are also coming out in videos with big ass beer bellies using the N-word with a whole different look. And no disrespect to rapper King Tiger OG from the Haystack. I don't know this guy personally, and it's not my intentions to disrespect him in the movement that he's out there pushing. But he's one of the examples I'm using because he's one of the only examples who's out there like that. But as far as what I personally think about it, you know, again, it's different from the era that I came from, and I personally don't act or talk like that myself, but to each his own. You know, I can't say that I'm completely new to it either though, because like I said, growing up in San Francisco and just being a Bay Area native myself, I'm used to having homeboys who used to talk and act like that all the time. In fact, when I first went to the joint back in the 80s, a lot of the other northerners I used to run into that had met other northerners from the city used to ask me all the time how I was able to grow up out there and not act and talk like a lot of my homies. And I used to tell them that I just never picked up on it, and I just never agreed with using the N-word or talking like that. I think going to prison at a young age also had a lot to do with it too. Because look, the last thing I'll say about it is this. I lived through the 70s, 80s, 90s, and the millennium. So I kind of seen how the swag evolved over the years. What I mean is this. In the 70s and 80s, an era where racial disparities were still kind of on the mend, the Africanos weren't as tolerant or acceptable about allowing other people outside of their race to use the N-word. If you had the wrong paint job and you said it at the wrong time in the wrong situation, you'd end up getting mollywopped and boo-bopped. But like I said, this would eventually change over time, and rap music and cultural changes would make them more tolerant and acceptable to other races saying it. You know, the other thing I can tell you guys without a doubt is this. These guys today that are running around with Nuestra Familia and Familiano tattoos blasted all over them are basically just reaping the benefits and the spoils of the title without really having to put in the work. And I'll tell you exactly what I mean by this. Everything has completely changed since the time when I was a member back in the early 90s until the present. When Corny, Skip, Tibbs, Pinky, and some of the other NF leadership was still housed in Pelican Bay, pre-Operation Black Widow, we were required to stay in close contact, and they monitored our movements from the day we got out until we would end up getting caught up. We were required to stay in consistent contact through our channels, and we also had to find visitors to pull these guys out wherever they were at, whether it was Pelican Bay, Santa Rita, the Glen Dyer detention facility in Oakland, etc., etc. That's why so many of us ended up catching cases and getting busted, because they made sure we were out there involved neck deep in criminal activity whenever any of us got out. We didn't have the luxury of cutting rap videos, standing around drinking, showing off our tattoos, and exploiting the NF like it's being done now. I would even go out on a limb and say that when this last group of self-appointed leaders in the state that included Conejo, DC, and Chuco, before they were all indicted and shipped off to the feds, were in power, I would even go out on a limb and say that when this last group of self-appointed leaders in the state that included Conejo, DC, and Chuco, before they were all indicted and shipped off to the feds, were in power, that they were also keeping close tabs on any and all NF members that paroled and got back out to the streets. They had them all plugged in and assigned to different NF-based street regiments based on where they paroled to. But now that everyone's gone and in federal prison, most of these guys that are out there on the streets right now, who are all slung back with NF tattoos, are either incommunicado, they're not plugged in, or they're so loosely tapped in that they're basically doing what they want. These guys that are claiming to be NF members that are out there on the streets right now are comfortable and complacent because they don't have the type of leaders controlling them like we did. They have it made. I hope you guys understand what I'm trying to say. If there was ever a perfect time or a preferred time to be functioning as an NF member on the streets, it would definitely be right now. Because like I said, these guys are running around with so much rope that they're basically doing what they want. They don't have leadership riding them and directing them to go drop bodies out there in Salinas or San Jose. Or they don't have to worry about slinging peas and then sending thousands back to one of the figureheads who's controlling that area from inside somewhere. They don't have to function every single day in a street regiment with an appointed crew that are all dialed in like that. And trust me, I know what I'm talking about because I still talk to people who are still in the mix out there. And they even tell me it's nothing like it used to be. Those days are long gone. Instead, these guys are running around with big NF tattoos subliminally telling everyone, hey, look at me, so everyone can see who they are, while they're no longer being required to do anything within the criminal element except exploit the NF title like they're doing. You know, and like I said, no disrespect to them, I think it's good that NF members can be out there on the streets and are no longer being forced to go back to prison. You know, and I'll just say this, anyone who might say that I was exploiting the NF title myself because of the tattoo I had blasted on the back of my head, you know, that might be true, but at least I can say I did it during a time when I was required to work for the NF on a daily basis, and that I was one of many who was out there committing serious crimes because we not only had to, but we were also dialed in under NF leadership like we were supposed to be. You know, and I'm referring to individuals like myself, Smokey, Baki, Bubba, Wino, and G-Money, who are all from Salinas, and then there's others like Baby Joker, Doughboy, and Lucifer from Watsonville, Chewy and Nicoya from San Francisco, and the list goes on and on. I don't think these guys really know how easy they have it. You know, everybody from that era is gone now, so they all get to run around and do what they want. They don't have to worry about being forced to catch criminal cases or homicides because nobody's pushing that kind of line. And then they don't have to worry about getting caught up in those kind of politics either. You know, like I said, they're languishing in the attention that they're getting, playing the role of a big homie. It's just crazy seeing it. You know, I wish I would have been active at a time like this. I would have been able to slide back and do things at my own pace. You know, chances are a lot of us would still be out there and we wouldn't have been forced to catch criminal cases like we did. You know, again, if you guys remember a lot of my past stories, a lot of us seen the walls closing in on us and even communicated this to leadership. But at that time, these guys were dinosaurs who hadn't been out on the streets since the 70s and 80s when law enforcement technology was nowhere even close to what it is now. Instead of telling us to shut it down and let these areas cool down before we continued forward with our criminal operations, leadership unfortunately had tunnel vision from the 70s and 80s, and they basically told us to continue generating money anyway, not really knowing the full scope of what we were really up against out there. And that was even on top of telling them that we had found GPS tracking devices on our cars. That was supposed to be a blessing and a clear message that it was time to shut it down and to go dormant. But that wasn't even a good enough reason for them to say, okay, shut it down and don't worry about making money. That'll come back later. You know, that's when I knew that leadership cared more about lining their pockets than they did about our freedom. It was a cold reality that we all had to accept, but the writing was definitely on the wall. You know, I know I kind of got off track answering this question, but it was a loaded question, and I wanted to make sure that I answered it from a few different angles. So Taco420 wants to know, how have you been able to overcome addiction and stay grounded without going back to prison or without involving yourself in criminal activity? Also, what have you done to try to mend or reconcile the relationships you have with your kids? Another good question. I would have to say, by reflecting back on some of the worst adversity I've faced and the things that I've lost when I was deep in the throes of my past addiction, thinking about my health and how bad I used to feel every morning when I used to wake up sick because I hadn't done my wake up yet, or thinking about how addiction kept me trapped and a prisoner in my own body. You know, I've talked about this before in several episodes of Inner Demons, and I'm sure I'll be talking more about it. But in retrospect, when I think back to all those days when I wanted to go on vacation or somewhere, and I couldn't go until I made sure I had enough dope to sustain me for however many days I was going to be gone, that's definitely not a good way to live your life. And then you got to understand that it not only affects you, but it also affects your significant other as well, because they have to endure being trapped and grounded with you. And eventually that's going to begin to weigh on your relationship, because nobody can find happiness living like that. You know, they might be able to tolerate it for a period of time, but sooner or later when things don't change, they're going to ask themselves, what am I doing here? When is this going to change? All I keep getting is a bunch of broken promises. You know, remembering all these things collectively and being honest with myself have helped me stay clean, especially during those times when my mind started to drift off and I started to entertain those weaknesses, telling myself that I can just do it one time and I'll be okay. Those are the kind of things that you have to be honest with yourself about, because when you start to question those things or second guess yourself, that's when you basically lost half the battle. But I'll say the biggest thing for me has always been reflecting back on all those days when I was strung out and I used to look at other people who were normal, who I knew could wake up without having a fix. I used to tell myself that those people were lucky, that they were lucky for just having some semblance of normalcy in their lives. But in all actuality, it wasn't that they were lucky for being normal and for not being strung out. I had to realize that I was the one who deprived myself of that normalcy, and that it had nothing to do with luck at all. It was all about choices, and I was making all the wrong ones. And with that in mind, I just want to say this. Despite having made a lot of strides and good changes in my life since I've been out, the one thing I still want to be clear about is that I've never claimed or professed to be completely rehabilitated. I'm in no way, shape, or form even close to winning that fight. Because even after having been out for over 13 years now, I've still had to fight back thoughts of temptation when it's come to addiction or getting caught up in criminal activity. I don't know how many times I went to a bank to cash a check or to withdraw some money, and as I was standing there in line, I caught myself staring at someone else who was withdrawing a large amount of cash. And the fleeting thought crossed my mind that fast that this was an opportunity for a quick come up or an easy way to answer some of my financial problems. Because I got used to making fast money, where sometimes I could make a couple $1,000s from just one transaction. But now that I was working a legitimate job or earning money the honest way, it just wasn't coming in as fast. And this was a tough transition that I had to get used to. You know, there's been a number of times when I've also thought about picking up a bag and just making a quick few $1,000s just to get ahead and solve some of my financial problems that I was dealing with at that time. And when these thoughts have crept into my mind, I'm smart enough to know that this is the old alter ego boxer way of thinking that's always got me into trouble before in the past. But I've been fortunate enough to find the strength and the mental fortitude to shake those thoughts off by reminding myself about what I stand to lose if I allow myself to get caught up, and how messed up it would be to go back to prison at this point in my life. So I'm far from being rehabilitated, and I've never claimed that I'm a completely changed person from the guy that I used to be. As far as reconciling my relationships with my kids, that's also still a work in progress, and that's another battle in itself. Because again, even though I've been out for almost 13 years now and have tried to fit in the role of being a real father to my kids, there's still a lot of work I need to do to even get close to mending those relationships. For those of you who've also been to prison, you guys know as well as I do that our kids resent us for abandoning them and for not being there all those years that we've missed. All the birthdays, the Christmases, the graduations, and all the other holidays that we missed. Then there's all the little things that we've also deprived them out of as well. Not being there with them to go over their school report cards, not being there during some of their sporting events, and then just not being there as a real parent. I missed over 20 years of that for both my son and daughter, and now I've got grandkids that I'm trying to build relationships with as well. You know, it just takes time. Expressing how bad I feel and apologizing for not being a real father to them only goes so far. And anyone who has kids who also spend a good amount of time in prison should know exactly what I'm talking about. You know, I spend most of my time now concentrating on what I can do to make things better going forward instead of dwelling on the past or making aimless apologies. That's all I can do. So Mad Dog Ace wants to know, I've been following your channel for several years now, and I've heard you make subtle comments about regretting some of the past choices you made. What are some of the biggest regrets you have? And do you carry around a lot of guilt inside based on having to turn your back on some of the people you were once loyal to? You know, I don't spend hours walking around with my chin in my chest feeling sorry for myself or beating myself up over things I can't change. I sleep well at night, and contrary to what some people might think, I can look myself in the mirror and look myself dead in my own eyes and own those choices. But on the flip side, I'd be lying if I didn't say I wish things could have played out different, or that I wish I wouldn't have had to make some of the choices that I did. No matter how many times I say it or how many different ways I explain it, some people will never understand. All they see is black and white. You know, those were my people I was willing to give my life for, and in fact, people who I did risk losing my life for on many occasions. And that's not something that you can just turn on and off at the blink of an eye, at least not for myself. But what I can also say without a shadow of a doubt is that I'm not a sour dude. I don't hate everybody that's still active like a lot of these DOs do. Did I fail the mission? I guess I did. But then again, it all depends on how you look at it. You know, I was committed to completing that mission, regardless of what that might have included. And I know that I had proved that 10 times over based on what I had already been involved in at that point. The same way that I'm sure a lot of Norteños and NF members are. But everybody that was there in the Santa Clara County Jail that knows the truth about my story knows that I was politicked on, and that a small group of individuals who had an agenda sabotaged my status. Things would have definitely been different if Chuco would have put a leash on his toy poodle, Lencho, so that I could have just been left alone to fight my case and get wiped out. Because later on, after everything was said and done and the truth finally came out, even though it didn't matter at that point, at least people found out what I was saying was true all along. All the dumbasses that acted like they had a crystal ball and who assumed that they knew what was going on, had to accept the fact that they were wrong and that they should have just minded their own business. And then karma took care of the rest of it, because look at them all now. Every last one of them ended up in bad standings and in situations themselves. But regardless of how everything played out or why it happened, it is what it is. And I guess everything happens for a reason. One thing's definitely for sure. I never would have made it back out if those that decided to push that agenda wouldn't have did what they did. So in the big scheme of things, I guess I should be thankful for that part of it. So Broken Bobby wants to know if the Cadillac symbol is something significant as far as political tattoos for the Northern faction. I'm personally not aware of anything significant either politically or symbolically with respects to the Cadillac symbol. The only thing even remotely close that I can think of is the trademark symbol that Gold Toes from San Francisco uses to represent his music label, GT Digital Distribution. You know, I've seen other people, even low budget YouTube channels, bite off of his style and try to use similar trademark symbols that have a close likeliness of Gold Toes' to represent their channels. Am I surprised? Absolutely not, especially based on who it is and given their past track record and all the other foul crap that they've done in the past. It lines right up with who they are. Anyways, I hope you guys have enjoyed this Q&A. If you liked it, give it a thumbs up. If you didn't like it, give it a thumbs down. But either way, drop a comment and let me know what you think. And again, something else that's extremely important that I'm going to continue to keep reminding you guys about is to not only hit the like, drop a comment, and share the video, but also hit the all symbol on the notification bell so you're advised whenever I drop content on the channel. So with that being said, as always, I just want to thank those of you who continue to show your unwavering support and for also continuing to tap into the channel. In the meantime, you guys enjoy the rest of your day and keep pushing that positivity. Until the next one, this is your boy B, and I'm gone.